In the mist-shrouded valleys of ancient Latium, where crimson sunsets paint the seven hills in shades of fire and gold, lies a story that will shake you to your very core. A tale of twin brothers bound by blood yet torn apart by ambition, of desperate men who committed an unthinkable act, and of courageous women who transformed unspeakable trauma into the foundation of peace. This is not merely the chronicle of a city's birth, but a haunting mirror that reflects the shadows still cast over our world today. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments, where women walk in fear and the choices we make echo through eternity. Before emperors ruled from marble thrones, before legions marched across continents, there existed a land of breathtaking beauty and untamed wilderness. The region of Latium stretched like an emerald tapestry beneath the watchful eyes of the gods, its rolling meadows dotted with sacred groves where ancient spirits whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Rivers carved silver ribbons through fertile valleys, their waters singing songs that had echoed since the dawn of time. This was a land where every stone held memory, where every breeze carried the prayers of countless generations who had called this place home. The people of Latium lived simply but richly, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of earth and sky. In small settlements scattered across the hills, families gathered around hearth fires as twilight descended, sharing stories that bound them to their ancestors and to each other. Children played in sun-dappled clearings while their mothers tended gardens bursting with herbs and vegetables, their laughter mixing with the gentle lowing of cattle and the distant call of shepherds guiding their flocks home. The men of these communities were farmers and craftsmen, their hands coal used from honest labor, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They knew the satisfaction of watching grain ripen golden in the fields, of forging tools that would serve their families for generations. Their wives were the keepers of wisdom, the ones who understood the healing properties of plants, who could read the signs in cloud formations and bird flight, who held the community together through times of feast and famine, with their quiet strength and boundless love. In the heart of this pastoral paradise stood the ancient city of Alba Longa, its white walls gleaming like bones against the green hillsides. Here ruled King Numitor, a just and beloved leader whose reign had brought prosperity and peace to the land. The city's markets bustled with merchants from distant shores, their stalls overflowing with exotic spices, shimmering silks and precious metals that caught the light like captured stars. The air hummed with the sounds of artisans at work, the ring of hammer on anvil, the rhythmic clacking of looms, the gentle scraping of chisels against marble. But even in this golden age, shadows gathered at the edges of paradise. Numitor's younger brother, Amulius, watched from the darkness with eyes that burned with envy and ambition. Where Numitor saw responsibility and service to his people, Amulius saw only power waiting to be seized. The throne that should have been shared between brothers became in Amulius's twisted mind a prize that belonged to him alone. The sacred groves that surrounded Alba Longa seemed to sense the coming storm. Ancient oak trees, their massive trunks scarred by centuries of lightning strikes, swayed restlessly even when no wind stirred their leaves. The priests who tended the shrines spoke in hushed tones of omens and portents, of eagles flying backward, of springs running red at dawn, of newborn lambs born with markings that resembled tears. In the temple of Vesta, where the eternal flame had burned uninterrupted for countless generations, The virgin priestesses felt an unexplained chill despite the warmth of the sacred fire. They whispered among themselves of dreams that came night after night, visions of two infants floating on dark waters while a great she-wolf watched from the shadows. These dreams meant something. They always did, but their meaning remained as mysterious as the flickering shadows that danced on the temple walls. The common people, going about their daily lives, felt the tension without understanding its source. Conversations at the market grew quieter, more guarded. Mothers held their children a little closer as they walked the streets. Farmers looked up from their plows more often, scanning the horizon for threats they couldn't name but somehow knew were coming. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Young lovers still met in moonlit gardens, their hearts full of hope and dreams of the future. Families still celebrated the birth of children with joy and feasting, their homes filled with laughter and song. But beneath the surface of this normalcy, something fundamental was shifting. The old certainties that good would triumph over evil, that justice would prevail, that the gods protected the innocent, began to feel as fragile as morning frost. In the hills beyond the city, shepherds reported strange sights. Wolves had been seen moving in unusual patterns, their howls carrying notes that seemed almost like morning songs. The streams that had run clear for generations now showed traces of silt, as if the earth itself was weeping. Birds that had nested in the same trees for countless seasons suddenly took flight, their migrations following paths that defied all understanding. This was the world into which destiny would soon introduce two souls whose lives would shake the very foundations of everything their people held sacred. A world where the line between civilization and wilderness ran thin as spider's silk, where the gods still walked among mortals in the rustle of leaves and the crash of thunder, where a single act of betrayal could topple kingdoms and reshape the course of history. The stage was set, the players waiting in the wings of fate. Soon the peaceful valleys of Latium would echo with cries that would pierce the hearts of generations yet unborn, and the gentle streams would run red with blood spilled in the name of power and desperate need. But in these final moments of innocence, the land held on to its beauty, its tranquility, its hope, precious gifts that would soon be tested by forces beyond imagination. In the heart of Alba Longa's royal palace, where marble columns stretched toward painted ceilings that depicted the eternal dance of gods and mortals, lived Princess Rhea Silvia, whose beauty was whispered about in every corner of the kingdom. Her hair cascaded like liquid amber down her shoulders, and her eyes held the deep green of forest pools where sunlight danced on water. But it was not her physical beauty that captured hearts. It was the gentle wisdom that seemed to flow from her very soul, the way she could comfort a crying child with a single touch, or bring peace to feuding neighbors with words soft as silk yet strong as iron. Rhea Silvia had chosen the sacred path, dedicating her life to the goddess Vesta as one of her virgin priestesses. In the temple's inner sanctum, where the eternal flame cast dancing shadows on ancient walls, she spent her days in prayer and contemplation, tending to the sacred fire that represented the very soul of their people. Her devotion was not born of duty alone, but from a deep love for the divine that seemed to shine from within her like a beacon. The other priestesses often spoke of how the goddess herself seemed to walk beside Rhea Silvia, how flowers bloomed brighter in her presence, how even wild animals grew calm at her approach. But the gods, in their infinite mystery, had woven a different thread into the tapestry of her fate. Mars, the mighty god of war, whose bronze armor gleamed like captured sunfire, and whose voice could shake the very mountains, had watched the young priestess from his celestial realm, and felt his immortal heart stir with a love that defied the ancient laws. Night after night, he descended from Olympus's heights, appearing to Rhea Silvia in dreams that felt more real than waking life, speaking words of passion that echoed in her soul long after dawn broke over the sacred groves. Their divine romance bloomed in the space between earth and heaven, in stolen moments when the veil between mortal and immortal grew thin. Mars would appear to her in the temple gardens at twilight, his warrior's strength gentle by tenderness, his fierce eyes soft with an adoration that spanned the cosmos. They would walk among the olive trees, their love a secret shared only with the stars that witnessed their whispered promises and sacred vows. From this impossible union, blessed yet forbidden, came the miracle of new life. Twin sons grew within Rhea Silvia's womb, and with them came visions that both thrilled and terrified her. In her dreams she saw 2 eagles soaring above 7 hills, their wings casting shadows that would one day shelter millions. She saw walls rising from the earth, gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun, and heard the sound of marching feet that would echo across continents. But she also saw blood, rivers of it, and heard the cries of women whose names she did not know, but whose pain she felt as her own. When the twins were born under a blood-red moon that painted the entire sky the color of war, they entered the world with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom and tiny fists that grasped at the air as if already reaching for crowns. The midwife who delivered them swore she saw divine fire flickering around their small bodies, and the temple cats, normally shy creatures, came padding into the birthing chamber to keep vigil like silent guardians. Rhea Silvia named them Romulus and Remus, their very names carrying the weight of prophecy. Romulus, born first by mere moments, had hair the color of burnished copper and eyes like molten gold, a child who seemed to command attention even in sleep. His cries were strong and demanding, as if he were already claiming his place in the world. Remus, gentler in temperament but no less remarkable, had raven-black hair and eyes the deep blue of midnight skies. Where Romulus grasped, Remus observed. Where Romulus commanded, Remus contemplated. As the twins grew in those first precious days, their mother would hold them close and whisper stories of their divine heritage, telling them of their father's strength and courage, of the great destiny that awaited them. She sang ancient lullabies that had been passed down through generations of mothers, melodies that spoke of heroes and honor, of love stronger than death, of sacrifice that transforms into glory. But even in these moments of perfect tenderness, darkness was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. King Amulius, who had seized the throne through treachery and murder, lived in constant fear that his crimes would be discovered and punished. His spies whispered in his ears like venomous serpents, bringing news of every birth, every rumor, every sign that might threaten his stolen crown. When word reached him of his niece's impossible pregnancy and the birth of twins whose very existence challenged the natural order, his paranoia bloomed into deadly resolve. The usurper king paced his throne room like a caged wolf, his crown sitting heavy on a head that had never been meant to wear it. His advisors, men whose loyalty had been bought with gold and threats, watched nervously as their master's rage built like pressure in a sealed vessel. They had seen this fury before. It was the same cold wrath that had driven him to murder his own brother, the same calculating cruelty that had allowed him to steal a kingdom and sleep soundly in his victim's bed. In the palace corridors, servants went about their duties with downcast eyes and quickened steps, sensing the approaching storm but powerless to prevent it. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the moment when Amulius would make his move. Guards stood at attention with hands resting on sword hilts, ready to carry out whatever commands their king might give, no matter how monstrous those orders might be. Meanwhile, in the temple of Vesta, Rhea Silvia held her precious sons close to her heart, memorizing every detail of their perfect faces, breathing in their sweet infant scent, feeling their tiny heartbeats against her chest. She knew, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to mothers in moments of ultimate danger, that their time together was measured not in years or even months, but in days, perhaps hours. The stage was set for a tragedy that would echo through history, but from that tragedy would emerge a legend that would inspire countless generations. In the innocent sleep of two divine infants lay the seeds of an empire that would span the known world, but first they would have to survive the cruel whims of a man who saw children not as miracles, but as threats to be eliminated. The whispers began in the servant quarters of the palace, carried on hushed voices that trembled with fear and disbelief. Kitchen maids paused in their bread making to exchange worried glances, their flour-dusted hands shaking as they spoke of the king's increasingly erratic behavior. Guards who had once stood proudly at their posts now shifted nervously, their eyes darting toward shadows as if expecting death itself to emerge from the darkness that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. King Amulius had begun consulting the oracle of Apollo more frequently, his visits to the sacred cave becoming almost daily pilgrimages of paranoia. The old priestess, her eyes milky white with age and divine sight, spoke in riddles that chilled the usurper's blood. 2 eagles shall rise from the ashes of betrayal, she intoned, her voice echoing off the cavern walls like the whisper of fate itself. From the loins of the sacred virgin, wolves shall be born to devour the throne of the usurper. Each prophecy was a dagger twisted in Amulius's guilty conscience, each vision a reminder that his reign was built upon foundations of sand and blood. In the temple of Vesta, Rhea Silvia felt the approaching danger like a cold wind that seemed to seep through even the thickest walls. The eternal flame, which had burned steady and bright for generations, now flickered strangely, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with malevolent life. The other priestesses spoke in worried tones of omens and portents, of sacred birds refusing to eat, of wine turning sour in blessed chalices, of the very air itself growing heavy with the weight of impending doom. The twins, now several weeks old, seemed to sense their mother's growing desperation. Romulus, usually so demanding and vocal, became unusually quiet, his golden eyes following every movement in the room, as if he were already learning to read the faces of those who might mean him harm. Remus, typically the gentler of the two, would cry inconsolably at night, his wails echoing through the temple corridors like the keening of lost souls. Rhea Silvia spent her days in desperate prayer, kneeling before the altar until her knees bled, begging the gods to protect her innocent children from the storm she knew was coming. Her hands, once steady as she tended the sacred flame, now trembled as she performed her duties. The other priestesses watched her with growing concern, seeing how the weight of her secret knowledge was slowly crushing the life from her spirit. But it was not only in the palace and temple that darkness gathered. Throughout Alba Longa, the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. Merchants reported strange happenings in the marketplaces, scales that would not balance properly, milk that soured before it could be sold, coins that seemed to burn the hands of those who touched them. Farmers found their crops withering in fields that had been fertile for generations, while their livestock grew restless and fearful, as if sensing invisible predators stalking through the night. The citizens of Alba Longa, once content and prosperous under the just rule of the murdered King Numitar, now lived under the oppressive weight of his brother's paranoid tyranny. Tax collectors appeared at doors with increasing frequency, their demands growing more unreasonable with each visit. Families who had lived comfortably for generations suddenly found themselves struggling to feed their children, while the royal treasury swelled with wealth stolen from the very people Amulius was sworn to protect. Young men began to disappear from their homes, conscripted into the king's personal guard, or sent on mysterious missions from which they never returned. Mothers wept in secret, afraid to mourn their lost sons too openly, lest they draw the attention of the royal spies who seemed to lurk in every shadow. Fathers taught their remaining children to keep their heads down, to speak carefully, to trust no one beyond their immediate family. In the royal council chambers, Amulius surrounded himself with advisors whose loyalty had been purchased through fear rather than respect. These men, their souls corrupted by their proximity to power, whispered poison in their king's ears, feeding his paranoia like fuel thrown upon an already raging fire. They spoke of threats real and imagined, of conspiracies that existed only in the king's fevered imagination, of the need for increasingly harsh measures to maintain order in a kingdom that had known peace for generations. Among these corrupt counselors was Flavius, a man whose heart had been eaten away by ambition until nothing remained but a hollow shell filled with cunning and cruelty. It was Flavius who first spoke the words that would seal the twins' fate, his voice smooth as poisoned honey as he leaned close to the king's ear during a particularly dark council session. "My lord," he whispered, his breath cold against Amulius's cheek, "the children of your niece grow stronger each day. Already the people whisper of divine signs and portents. How long before these whispers become shouts of rebellion? How long before they rally around these innocent babes and seek to restore what they believe is the rightful line to your throne?" The seed of terrible resolve began to sprout in Amulius's mind. Nurtured by fear and watered with the blood of his previous crimes, he began to pace his chambers at night, his footsteps echoing through empty halls like the countdown to an execution. Sleep fled from him entirely, replaced by waking nightmares where he saw infant hands reaching for his crown, heard baby cries that sounded like war horns calling his enemies to battle. The natural order itself seemed to rebel against what was coming. The Tiber River, which had flowed clear and sweet for countless centuries, began to run muddy and strange. Fish died in vast numbers, their silver bodies floating downstream like a river of omens. The sacred geese of Juno, kept in the temple courtyard, refused to eat and huddled together as if seeking protection from an invisible threat. But perhaps most ominous of all were the dreams that began to plague the innocent throughout the kingdom. Children woke screaming from visions of wolves and rivers, of floating baskets and crying babies. Pregnant women spoke of nightmares where they gave birth to serpents, while their husbands tossed in restless sleep, haunted by images of betrayal and blood. The threads of fate were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that would soon become visible to all, a design written in suffering that would ultimately birth both destruction and glory in equal measure. In the growing darkness of Amulius's heart, a decision was taking shape, one that would echo through the ages and transform two innocent infants into the stuff of legend. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a guard whose face was pale as morning mist, and whose hands trembled as he presented the royal seal. Rhea Silvia knew, with the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of ultimate dread, that her worst fears were about to become reality. The parchment felt heavy in her fingers, heavier than lead, heavier than the weight of worlds, as she broke the crimson wax that bore her uncle's mark. By royal decree, the message read in script that seemed to writhe like serpents across the page. The Princess Rhea Silvia is commanded to appear before His Majesty King Amulius at the second hour after sunrise, bringing with her the offspring, born of her violation of sacred vows. Let no delay be permitted, lest the anger of the crown fall upon all who shelter these children of shame. The words cut deeper than any blade, each syllable a poisoned dart aimed at her heart. But it was not the cruel language that filled her with despair. It was the cold calculation behind it, the way her uncle had reduced her divine sons to mere offspring. the clinical detachment with which he prepared to destroy the most precious things in her world. In the palace, Romulus sat upon his stolen throne, like a spider in the center of a web woven from fear and hatred. The great hall, once a place where justice was dispensed with wisdom and mercy, had been transformed into a chamber of shadows and whispered threats. Tapestries depicting the noble history of Alba Longa had been replaced with darker images, scenes of conquest and submission, of enemies crushed beneath the wheels of royal chariots, of justice bent to serve the will of those with power. The king's appearance had changed dramatically in the weeks since the twins' birth. His hair, once lustrous and black, had taken on a greyish pallor that made him look far older than his years. Deep lines had carved themselves around his eyes, trenches dug by sleepless nights and the constant gnawing of paranoia. His hands, adorned with rings torn from the fingers of his victims, shook with a tremor that no amount of wine could still. Around him clustered his corrupt advisors like carrion birds around a corpse, their hungry eyes gleaming with anticipation of the violence to come. They had grown fat on the suffering of others, these men who had traded their souls for positions of influence in a court built upon murder and betrayal. Chief among them stood Flavius, his smile as cold and sharp as winter steel, his whispered words dripping with malicious pleasure. "The river runs high today, my lord," he murmured, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the oppressive silence of the throne room. "Perfect conditions for disposal. The waters will carry away all evidence of your mercy, should you choose to grant these unfortunate infants a swift journey to the underworld rather than the slower death of exposure." The Tiber River, that ancient waterway that had nourished the land of Latium for millennia, had indeed swollen with recent rains until it raged like a living thing, its muddy waters churning with debris and carrying the scent of distant storms. Local fishermen spoke fearfully of how their nets came up empty, how the fish seemed to have fled to deeper waters, how even the river spirits appeared to have abandoned their sacred groves along the banks. As Rhea Silvia made her way through the palace corridors, each step felt like walking toward her own execution. The twins slept peacefully in her arms, Romulus nestled against her left breast, Remus cradled in her right arm, their innocent faces unmarked by knowledge of the fate that awaited them. Guards who had once bowed respectfully to the princess now averted their eyes, unable to meet the gaze of a woman they knew was walking toward unimaginable loss. The great doors of the throne room groaned open like the gates of the underworld, revealing the scene within. Her uncle seated upon his throne of blood and lies, his courtiers arranged around him like demons attending their master. The air itself felt thick with malevolence, heavy with the weight of impending atrocity. "Approach," Romulus commanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls with a sound like grinding stone. "Bring your bastard spawn forward that all may see the fruits of your shame." But even as the words left his lips, something extraordinary happened. The twins, as if sensing the evil that surrounded them, opened their eyes simultaneously. Romulus's golden gaze met his great-uncle's stare without flinching, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the infant's eyes held a wisdom and strength that made the king step backward in his throne. Remus, gentle Remus, smiled, a radiant expression of pure innocence that seemed to illuminate the dark chamber like a shaft of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Several courtiers gasped audibly, for in that moment divine fire seemed to flicker around the baby's forms, a golden aura that spoke of their immortal heritage. One advisor fell to his knees, overcome by a sudden recognition of the sacred nature of what he was witnessing. Even the guards, hardened men who had carried out countless orders without question, shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving instinctively away from their weapons. But Romulus, his heart poisoned beyond redemption by years of guilt and paranoia, saw only threat where others saw miracle. The divine light that played around his grandnephews served only to confirm his worst fears. Here was power that could topple kingdoms, strength that could challenge the gods themselves, wrapped in the innocent forms of newborn babes. "You see how they mock us even now," he hissed to his assembled court, his voice rising to a shriek that seemed to crack the very air. "Look how they stare with eyes that hold no proper fear, how they smile as if they already know they will be our downfall. This is not natural. This is the breeding of monsters, of threats to everything we hold sacred." The decision crystallized in that moment, cold and final as winter frost. In his mind, Amulius saw not helpless infants but future conquerors, not innocent children but the instruments of his own destruction. The corruption that had eaten away his soul like acid completed its work, leaving behind only a hollow shell driven by fear and the desperate need to preserve his stolen throne at any cost. The trap had been set, the catalyst had emerged, and now nothing could prevent the terrible machinery of fate from grinding forward toward its inevitable blood-soaked conclusion. The royal decree was signed with hands that shook with anticipation rather than remorse, each stroke of the quill sealing the fate of two innocent souls. Amulius's chambers had become a war room, where the only enemy was helplessness itself, and the only victory lay in the destruction of divine children who had committed no crime save that of being born. The parchment, still wet with ink that seemed to gleam like blood in the flickering candlelight, bore words that would haunt the kingdom for generations to come. "Let it be known," the document proclaimed in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the very fabric of reality, that the bastard offspring of the disgraced priestess Rhea Silvia, born of unholy union and violation of sacred vows, are hereby condemned to death by exposure. Let them be cast upon the waters of the Tiber River, that the gods themselves may judge their worthiness to live. Flavius stood beside his king like a dark angel of vengeance, his pale fingers tracing the edges of the decree, as if savouring the texture of printed doom. His mind worked with the cold efficiency of a master craftsman, considering every detail of the plan that would rid them of this divine threat while maintaining the thin veneer of royal mercy. "The beauty of water, my lord," he whispered, his breath visible in the suddenly cold air of the chamber, "is that it leaves no fingerprints of guilt upon those who use it. The river will be seen as the executioner, not the crown. If the children survive, which they cannot, it will be viewed as divine intervention. If they perish, as nature surely intends, then the gods themselves will have rendered judgment on their illegitimate existence." The king nodded, his eyes gleaming with the fevered light of a man who has convinced himself that monstrous acts are actually heroic necessities. In his twisted logic, he was not murdering infants but saving his kingdom from future devastation. The corruption of his soul was now complete, transforming every natural instinct of protection into calculated cruelty. Outside the palace walls, the preparations began with the mechanical precision of men who had learned to follow orders without questioning their morality. A wicker basket was procured, ironically the same type used by mothers throughout the kingdom to carry bread and flowers from market, now repurposed as a vessel of death. The craftsman who wove it worked with trembling fingers, each strand of willow a prayer that he would not be held accountable for his unwilling participation in this atrocity. The basket was lined with soft cloth, and touch of mock tenderness that made the entire enterprise even more obscene. Palace servants moved through their tasks like sleepwalkers, their faces pale and drawn as they gathered the materials that would serve as both cradle and coffin for the divine twins. Some wept silently as they worked, their tears falling like rain upon fabric that would soon be soaked with river water and infant blood. Word spread through the palace like a plague. carried on whispered voices that trembled with horror and disbelief. Kitchen maids who had cooed over the babies during Rhea Silvia's secret visits now sobbed into their aprons, their hearts breaking at the thought of those perfect little faces disappearing beneath the dark waters. Guards who had once sworn oaths to protect the innocent found themselves faced with orders that violated every principle they held sacred. In the royal council chamber, maps of the Tiber River were spread across mahogany tables like battle plans for a war against innocence itself. Flavius traced the river's course with his finger, his voice clinical and detached as he explained the logistics of infanticide to men who had once been honorable soldiers and advisors. "Here," he said, pointing to a bend in the river, where the current ran swift and deep, "the waters will carry them beyond any hope of rescue. The nearest settlement is 3 leagues downstream, far too distant for any chance witness to intervene. By the time the basket reaches inhabited shores, if it reaches them at all, the matter will be concluded according to the will of the gods." Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their faces ashen as they contemplated their participation in this horror. But fear of their king's wrath kept them silent, their moral objections strangled by the same terror that had allowed Amulius to seize power in the first place. They had become accomplices to atrocity through their very passivity, their silence making them as guilty as if they had woven the death basket with their own hands. The timeline was established with the precision of a military campaign. The twins would be taken at dawn, when the mist rising from the river would provide cover for the grim procession. A select group of guards, chosen for their unquestioning loyalty rather than their virtue, would escort the basket to the designated spot and release it into the hungry current. No witnesses would be permitted, no records kept beyond the official decree that proclaimed divine judgment rather than royal murder. As night fell over Alba Longa, the city itself seemed to sense the approaching horror. Dogs howled in distant neighborhoods, their voices carrying a note of mourning that chilled the blood of all who heard it. The wind picked up, rattling shutters and doors like the restless spirits of future victims seeking entry into the world of the living. Dawn broke over Alba Longa, like a funeral shroud, the sky painted in shades of grey and crimson that seemed to weep for the innocents about to be lost. The air itself felt heavy with impending tragedy, thick as honey and twice as bitter, carrying on its currents the scent of river water and the distant sound of mourning doves whose calls echoed like lamentations across the waking city. In the temple of Vesta, Rhea Silvia held her sons for what she knew would be the final time, her tears falling like sacred rain upon their perfect faces. Romulus stirred in her arms, his tiny fist grasping at her finger with a strength that seemed to encompass all the love and hope in the world. Remus slept peacefully against her heart, his gentle breathing, a rhythm that she tried desperately to memorize, knowing that soon the only heartbeat in her chest would be the echo of unbearable loss. "My precious ones," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass against stone, "forgive me for bringing you into a world that cannot see your divine light. Forgive me for loving you too much to save you." Each word was a prayer, a plea to whatever gods might still be listening, a mother's desperate attempt to shield her children from the horror that approached on iron-shod feet. The guards who came for them moved with the mechanical precision of men who had murdered their own souls in service to a monster. Their armor, once polished bright with pride, now seemed dull and tarnished, as if even metal could not bear the weight of the evil it was about to facilitate. Captain Marcus, a man who had once bounced his own children on his knee, now avoided Rhea Silvia's eyes as he stepped forward with arms that felt like lead. "Princess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "by order of His Majesty, you must surrender the children." The word caught in his throat like a stone, for how could he call these divine infants anything but what they were, perfect, innocent, beloved? His hands trembled as he reached toward the twins, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, time seemed suspended between mercy and monstrosity. The twins, as if sensing the approaching separation, both opened their eyes simultaneously. Romulus fixed his golden gaze upon Captain Marcus, and in those infinite eyes the hardened soldier saw such wisdom, such divine fire, that he stumbled backward as if struck by lightning. Remus smiled, that same radiant expression that had illuminated the throne room, and several guards openly wept at the sight of such pure innocence faced with such calculated cruelty. But orders were orders, and fear of Amulius's wrath was stronger than the call of conscience. With movements that felt like sacrilege, the captain lifted the twins from their mother's arms, each baby a weight that seemed to pull his soul down into darkness. Rhea Silvia's cry of anguish echoed through the temple corridors, a sound so filled with primal grief that even the eternal flame flickered, as if in sympathy. The procession that formed was unlike any royal parade ever witnessed in Alba Longa. Instead of celebration, there was only the grim march of doom, the measured steps of men walking toward their own damnation. The basket, woven from innocent willow, but now transformed into an instrument of death, swayed gently as it was carried through streets that seemed to hold their breath in horror. Citizens who caught glimpses of the procession from behind shuttered windows, crossed themselves, and whispered prayers to whatever gods might still hold mercy in their hearts. Children were hurried inside by parents who could not bear to let them witness such an abomination. Even the dogs of the city fell silent, as if recognizing that something sacred was being defiled beyond all comprehension. At the riverbank, mist rose from the dark waters, like the breath of sleeping giants, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between the mortal realm and the land of spirits. The Tiber, swollen with recent rains, rushed past with a sound like distant thunder, its muddy current carrying branches and debris that spoke of the violence hidden beneath its deceptively smooth surface. The guards formed a circle around the designated spot, their faces masks of forced stoicism that barely concealed the horror writhing beneath. Captain Marcus approached the water's edge, the basket in his hands feeling heavier with each step, as if the very weight of the universe was pressing down upon his shoulders. The twins lay within, wrapped in soft cloth that would become their burial shroud, their eyes wide and trusting, still believing in a world that had not yet revealed its capacity for absolute evil. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Marcus hesitated. In his mind, he saw his own children sleeping safely in their beds, protected by his love and devotion. He thought of his wife's gentle hands comforting scraped knees and wounded hearts, of bedtime stories and lullabies, of all the tender moments that made life worth living. These twins deserved those same moments, those same protections, those same chances to grow and laugh and love. But the king's command burned in his ears like acid, and fear proved stronger than love. With emotion that damned his soul for all eternity, Captain Marcus released the basket into the hungry current, watching as the river claimed its innocent cargo and began to carry it toward whatever fate the gods might decree. The basket hit the water with a sound like breaking hearts, sending ripples across the Tiber's dark surface that seemed to carry with them the shattered dreams of an entire kingdom. The current seized the fragile vessel immediately, spinning it in lazy circles before catching it in the river's relentless embrace and beginning its journey toward the unknown. Inside, the twins stirred restlessly, their tiny hands reaching through the wicker walls, as if grasping for the mother they would never see again. Captain Marcus stood frozen at the water's edge, his soul cracking like ice beneath the weight of what he had just done. The other guards moved away from him, as if his guilt were contagious, their own faces pale with the recognition that they had all become accomplices in an act that would stain their names for eternity. The mist seemed to thicken around them, as if nature itself was trying to hide this abomination from the eyes of the gods. Back in the temple of Vesta, Rhea Silvia collapsed to her knees before the sacred altar, her anguished screams echoing off the marble walls like the cries of the damned. The eternal flame, which had burned steadily for generations, suddenly flared higher, its flames turning from gold to deep crimson, as if the goddess herself was weeping tears of fire. The other priestesses rushed to comfort her, but what comfort could be offered to a mother whose children had been torn from her arms and cast into the hungry waters of death? "My babies," she sobbed, her voice raw and broken. "My precious boys, Mars, mighty father of my sons. Where is your strength now? Where is your protection when your children need it most?" Her prayers became accusations, her pleas transformed into curses that seemed to make the very air crackle with divine fury. The temple cats, those sacred guardians who had kept vigil at the twins' birth, began to yowl in harmonious lament, their voices joining with their mistress's grief in a symphony of loss. Word of the atrocity spread through Alba Longa like wildfire, carried on whispers that grew louder with each retelling, until they became roars of outrage and disbelief. In the marketplace, merchants abandoned their stalls to gather in shop clusters, their faces ashen as they tried to comprehend how their king could have ordered such an unspeakable act. Mothers clutched their own children closer, their hearts breaking at the thought of Rhea Silvia's unbearable loss. "He has crossed a line from which there can be no return," whispered Marcus the baker, his flour-covered hands trembling as he spoke. "To murder infants, divine infants no less, is to invite the wrath of every god in the pantheon. Our city is cursed now, marked for destruction by this unholy deed." In the countryside surrounding Alba Longa, farmers working their fields reported strange phenomena that seemed to herald divine displeasure. Cattle lowed mournfully and refused to give milk, their eyes rolled back as if they could see invisible horrors stalking the land. Crops that had been thriving just days before began to wither on their stalks, their leaves turning black as if touched by frost despite the warmth of the morning sun. Even the earth itself seemed to reject the blood-soaked rain that had begun to fall, pooling in crimson puddles that refused to soak into soil that had been sanctified by centuries of honest labor. Meanwhile, the wicker basket continued its journey down the swollen Tiber, buffeted by currents that seemed almost purposeful in their violence. The twins, remarkably, had stopped crying, their divine heritage perhaps protecting them from the worst of the river's fury. Romulus gazed up at the grey sky, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, while Remus watched the passing banks with the quiet intensity of one who was already learning to read the language of survival. But even as their small vessel was tossed and spun by forces beyond their control, something miraculous was happening. Other creatures, sensing the divine nature of the basket's cargo, began to take notice. Fish swam beneath the fragile craft in protective schools, their silver bodies creating a living foundation that helped keep it afloat. Birds wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed almost like prayers, their cries carrying on the wind to distant ears that might yet offer salvation. In the palace, King Amulius paced his throne room like a man possessed, his paranoia momentarily satisfied, but his guilt eating at him like acid. Every shadow seemed to hide accusers, every whisper carried the sound of divine retribution approaching on wings of vengeance. He had achieved his goal, the threat to his throne had been eliminated, but the victory tasted of ash and blood, leaving him hollow and haunted. "It is done," Flavius announced with satisfaction. But even his cold smile seemed forced now, as if some part of his withered soul recognized the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The kingdom is safe from their threat, my lord. You have acted with the wisdom of Solomon and the strength of Mars himself, but safety felt as distant as the stars, and wisdom seemed to have fled Alba Longa like birds before a storm. The twins were gone, cast into the merciless waters to face whatever fate the gods might decree, leaving behind only the echo of their mother's grief and the terrible knowledge that innocence, no matter how pure or divine, could be destroyed by men who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The Tiber River carried its precious cargo through landscapes that seemed to mourn with every ripple and eddy, past banks lined with weeping willows, whose trailing branches reached toward the water, like desperate fingers trying to pluck the basket from its perilous journey. The current, swollen by spring rains and divine intervention alike, had transformed from executioner into unlikely protector, guiding the fragile vessel away from jagged rocks and treacherous rapids that would have shattered any ordinary craft. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows through the forest canopy that overhung the river, the twins' basket began to attract the attention of creatures great and small. A family of otters emerged from their den to swim alongside the vessel, their sleek bodies creating a living escort that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision. Overhead, ravens and eagles, natural enemies who should have been locked in aerial combat, instead flew together in unprecedented harmony, their wings creating a protective canopy that shielded the babies from the harsh glare of the sun. But it was not only the animal kingdom that sensed the divine nature of what floated upon the waters. In a sacred grove dedicated to the river god himself, ancient spirits that had slumbered for centuries began to stir. The nymphs who dwelt among the rushes lifted their ethereal heads, their translucent forms shimmering like heat mirages, as they whispered among themselves in voices that sounded like wind through grass. They had witnessed many things in their immortal existence, but never before had they seen such pure innocence cast upon the waters by such calculated evil. The blood of Mars flows in their veins, murmured Aqua, eldest of the water spirits, her form rippling like moonlight on waves. Yet their mother's mortal love burns brighter than any divine fire. These children carry within them the seeds of both destruction and creation, and their fate will shape the world for generations to come. Miles downstream from Alba Longa, on a hillside that commanded a sweeping view of the river valley, stood the humble dwelling of Faustulus, chief shepherd to the flocks that grazed these peaceful meadows. A man of simple faith and honest labor, Faustulus had spent his life caring for creatures that could not care for themselves, his weathered hands as gentle with newborn lambs as they were strong in defending his charges from wolves and other predators. On this morning that would change everything, Faustulus had risen before dawn to check on a ewe who was due to give birth. As he made his way down to the riverbank where she had chosen to make her nest, he noticed an unusual stillness in the air, as if the very world was holding its breath in anticipation. The birds that normally filled the morning with their songs remained silent in the trees, and even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted and distant. It was then that he saw her, a magnificent she-wolf unlike any he had ever encountered, her silver-grey coat gleaming like polished metal in the early light. She stood at the water's edge with an alertness that spoke of purpose rather than mere curiosity, her golden eyes fixed on something approaching from upstream. Faustulus had encountered many wolves in his years as a shepherd, had fought them off when they threatened his flocks, but this creature radiated a power that made him instinctively reach for the protective charms he wore around his neck. As the basket appeared around the river's bend, spinning slowly in the current, The she-wolf waded into the shallows without hesitation. Her movements were precise and deliberate, as if guided by an intelligence far beyond mere animal instinct. When the vessel came within reach, she gripped it gently in her powerful jaws and pulled it toward shore, her actions so careful that barely a drop of water splashed over the wicker rim. Faustulus watched in amazement as the wolf dragged the basket onto the muddy bank and began to investigate its contents. Instead of the growls and snarls he expected, he heard something that made his blood run cold with wonder. The sound of infant cries, weak but unmistakably human, rising from within the waterlogged vessel. "By all the gods," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. "What manner of miracle is this?" The she-wolf looked up at his approach, her eyes meeting his with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For a moment that stretched into eternity, shepherd and wolf regarded each other across a distance that measured not just physical space but the gap between the mundane world and the realm of divine intervention. Then, with movements that seemed choreographed by fate itself, she stepped aside, allowing Faustulus to approach the basket and discover its incredible contents. Inside, wrapped in cloth that should have been sodden, but was instead mysteriously dry, lay two infants whose beauty took his breath away. Their eyes, already open and alert despite their tender age, gazed up at him with a wisdom that seemed older than the hills themselves. The smaller one, with hair as dark as midnight, smiled at the sight of his weathered face, while his slightly larger brother fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Sweet Mercury's wings," Faustulus breathed, his hands trembling as he reached into the basket. "You are no ordinary children, are you, little ones? Someone wanted you dead, but the gods themselves have delivered you to safety." In the hills surrounding the Tiber Valley, word of the miracle spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Faustulus, his weathered face transformed by wonder and divine purpose, carried the twins to his modest dwelling, where his wife Acca Larentia waited with arms already open to receive these gifts from the gods. She was a woman whose own womb had been blessed with children, but whose heart remained vast enough to encompass even more love. And when she saw the divine infants, tears of joy streamed down her face like spring rain nourishing parched earth. "They are beautiful beyond mortal description," she whispered, cradling Romulus while Faustulus held Remus, both babies seeming to glow with an inner light that made the humble shepherd's hut feel like a palace. "Look at their eyes, husband. They hold the wisdom of ages, the fire of their divine father, and yet they need our protection just like any mortal children." The she-wolf, whom they named Lupa in honor of her sacred intervention, remained nearby as a silent guardian. Local shepherds who came to witness the miracle reported that she seemed to understand every word spoken about the twins, her golden eyes tracking conversations with an intelligence that spoke of divine purpose, rather than mere animal instinct. Children from neighboring farms brought wild flowers and honey cakes as offerings, somehow sensing that they were in the presence of something sacred. But while joy bloomed in the Shepherd's Valley, darkness deepened in Alba Longa, like ink spreading through clear water. King Amulius, expecting to feel relief after eliminating the threat to his throne, instead found himself plagued by nightmares more vivid than any waking terror. In his dreams he saw golden eyes staring at him from the depths of the river, heard infant cries that seemed to call his name in languages older than civilization itself. The royal court, once a place where ambitious men gathered to seek favor and power, had become a tomb filled with living ghosts. Advisors who had praised the king's decisive action now avoided his presence, their own guilt reflected in every surface like mirrors showing their corrupted souls. Flavius, the architect of the infanticide, paced the palace corridors at night like a spectre, his pale face haunted by visions of divine retribution that he could neither escape nor understand. My lord appears troubled, observed Senator Brutus during a council session, where the king's hands shook so violently he could barely hold his wine cup. Perhaps the affairs of state weigh too heavily upon your noble shoulders. The kingdom prospers under your wise guidance. Surely there is no cause for such distress. But Amulius could find no peace in prosperity built upon the murder of innocents. Every report of successful harvests reminded him of the lives he had tried to destroy. Every tribute from conquered territories felt like coins paid to ferry souls across the river Styx. The crown upon his head, once a symbol of power and authority, now felt like a circlet of thorns that drew blood from wounds that would never heal. Meanwhile, in the sacred groves where the old gods still held sway, the earth itself began to respond to the presence of Mars's divine sons. Trees that had been barren for decades suddenly burst into bloom, their branches heavy with fruit that tasted of nectar and starlight. Springs that had run dry began to flow again, their waters sweet and clear as liquid crystal. Animals gathered in unprecedented numbers, as if drawn by an invisible summons to witness something that would reshape the very foundations of the world. The twins themselves grew with supernatural speed and strength, their infant bodies already showing signs of the warriors they would become. Romulus, even as a baby, possessed a grip strong enough to bend iron, while Remus displayed a gentleness that could calm the wildest beasts with a single touch. Local smiths reported that metal tools worked near the children became sharper and more durable, while farmers found that crops planted in soil blessed by their presence grew 3 times their normal size. Stories of these miracles reached the ears of travelers and merchants who carried the tales to distant lands, where they grew and transformed with each retelling. In market squares and taverns throughout the region, people spoke in hushed tones of the divine children, who had been saved from death by the intervention of the gods themselves. Some claimed they were the sons of Mars come to reclaim their rightful inheritance. Others whispered that they were harbingers of a new age, destined to build something greater than any kingdom that had come before. But not all who heard these stories rejoiced in their telling. In the shadows of Alba Longa, Amulius's spies and informants brought word of the growing legend, their reports like poisoned arrows piercing the king's already wounded psyche. Each tale of miraculous survival, each account of divine intervention, confirmed his worst fears. The children he had tried to destroy were not only alive but growing stronger with each passing day. Impossible, he raged, sweeping goblets and scrolls from his desk in a fury that shook the palace walls. They were cast into the river. The waters themselves became their tomb. How can dead infants work miracles and inspire legends? But deep in his corrupt heart, Amulius already knew the answer. The gods themselves had intervened, transforming his act of evil into the foundation of something far greater than his petty kingdom. The twins lived, and with each breath they drew, his own reign moved one step closer to its inevitable and righteous end. Years passed like swift-flowing rivers, carrying with them the transformation of 2 divine infants into young men whose very presence seemed to bend the world around them. Romulus had grown into a figure of commanding authority, his copper hair now flowing like a lion's mane, and his golden eyes holding the fire of 1,000 suns. His voice, when raised in passion or anger, could shake the leaves from trees and inspire lesser men to feats of courage they never knew they possessed. Beside him stood Remus, his gentle nature now tempered with wisdom that seemed to flow from ancient wells of knowledge, his midnight hair framing a face that combined their mother's compassion with their father's strength. The brothers had discovered their true heritage through dreams that came with increasing frequency and clarity, visions of a weeping priestess, of a usurper's paranoia, of their own tiny forms cast upon dark waters that should have been their tomb. With this knowledge came a burning purpose that consumed them like divine fire. They would reclaim their grandfather's throne and bring justice to the man who had tried to murder them in their innocence. Their following had grown from a handful of loyal shepherds to an army of men who saw in the twins everything their current king was not: just brave, touched by divine favor, and blessed with the kind of natural leadership that inspired absolute devotion. Veterans of old wars came down from mountain retreats to serve under their banner. Young farmers abandoned their plows to take up swords in their name. Even merchants and craftsmen, normally peaceful folk who preferred profit to politics, found themselves drawn to the cause of restoring rightful rule to Alba Longa. The twins' war camp, established in a valley that had become known as the Vale of Destiny, buzzed with activity day and night. Weapons were forged in fires that burned brighter than any natural flame, their metal taking on a gleam that spoke of divine blessing. Strategies were planned around campfires where men spoke not just of tactics and supply lines, but of honor, justice, and the sacred duty to overthrow tyranny wherever it festered. "Brothers," Romulus addressed his gathered followers one evening, his voice carrying across the valley like rolling thunder, "we march not for conquest but for righteousness. The man who sits upon our grandfather's throne is no king. He is a murderer, a kinslayer, a coward who tried to drown babies rather than face them as men. When we take Alba Longa, we reclaim not just a crown but the very soul of our people." The assault on Alba Longa came at dawn, when mist still clung to the city walls like shrouds wrapping a corpse. The twins led from the front, their divine heritage making them seem to glow within a fire, as they charged toward gates that had been sealed in terror. Behind them came wave after wave of warriors whose battle cries echoed off the ancient stones like the voices of the gods themselves demanding justice. King Amulius, awakened by the sound of approaching doom, stumbled from his bed like a man already dead, his face pale as moonlight, and his hands shaking with the palsy of absolute terror. The nightmares that had plagued him for years were becoming reality, and with each shout from beyond the walls, he felt another piece of his sanity crumble away like mortar between old stones. "My lord," gasped Captain Marcus, the same man who had cast the twins upon the river years before, "they come with power beyond mortal comprehension. Our walls crack at their approach, our weapons turn to dust in our hands, the very stones cry out for justice against us." The battle, when it came, was less a clash of armies than a divine judgment written in blood and fire. The twins fought with the fury of avenging angels, their weapons seeming to cut through enemy ranks like wheat before the harvest scythe. Romulus's sword blazed with golden light that burned away lies and corruption wherever it touched, while Remus moved through the combat with deadly grace, his blade finding the hearts of tyrants with supernatural precision. The palace guards, men who had once enforced Amulius's cruel decrees without question, threw down their weapons rather than face the righteous anger of the divine princes. Some fell to their knees, begging forgiveness for their part in years of oppression. Others fled into the darkness, preferring exile to the judgment they knew they deserved. In the throne room where their fate had once been sealed, the twins finally confronted their great-uncle, the man whose paranoia had shaped their entire existence. Amulius cowered behind the throne that had never rightfully been his crown askew and his royal robes stained with the sweat of terror. "Please," he whimpered, his voice cracking like a boy's rather than a king's. "I was protecting the kingdom." The oracles spoke of threats, of children who would bring destruction. "I acted for the good of all." But Romulus's golden eyes held no mercy for the man who had tried to murder them in their cradles. "You acted from fear and greed," he declared, his voice ringing through the chamber like a judgment from Mount Olympus itself. You killed our grandfather for his crown, murdered our father for his throne, and tried to drown us for the crime of drawing breath. Justice delayed is not justice denied, uncle. Today the gods collect their due. The fall of Romulus was swift and final, his corrupt reign ending not with the pomp of royal ceremony, but with the simple justice of divine retribution. As his lifeless body crumpled to the marble floor, the very palace seemed to exhale in relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from stones that had grown weary of sheltering evil. Victory over the usurper should have brought unity and celebration, but instead it revealed the first cracks in the foundation of brotherly love that had sustained Romulus and Remus through years of exile and war. With Romulus dead and their grandfather's throne reclaimed, the twins found themselves facing a question that neither divine heritage nor mortal wisdom could easily answer. Who among them should rule the kingdom they had liberated together? The restored palace of Alba Longa, its halls still echoing with the ghosts of recent battle, became a stage for a tragedy that would make the gods themselves weep. Romulus paced the throne room with the restless energy of a caged lion, his golden eyes blazing with ambition that had been fed by years of righteous anger and divine purpose. The crown lay upon the marble table between them like a serpent coiled to strike, its jewels catching the lamplight and throwing fractured rainbows across walls that had witnessed too much bloodshed already. "Brother," Romulus said, his voice carrying the commanding tone that had inspired armies to follow him into battle, "the people look to us for leadership, but a kingdom cannot have two kings. One must step aside for the good of all." His words carried an expectation that made the very air tremble. Clearly he believed that Remus should be the one to yield, but Remus, whose gentle nature had never meant weakness, straightened to his full height and met his brother's gaze with eyes that held the deep wisdom of still waters. "And who decided that you should be that one king, Romulus? Was it the gods who spoke to you in dreams I was not privy to? Or was it simply the assumption that because you were born first by mere moments you deserved to rule over me for all eternity?" The words hung between them like drawn swords, each syllable sharp enough to cut through bonds that had seemed unbreakable since their birth. Around them the advisors and generals who had followed them to victory shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing the dissolution of something sacred, the death of unity that had been their greatest strength. "I have always been the leader," Romulus insisted, his voice rising with a heat that made the marble floors seem to radiate warmth. "When we were children, I was the one who protected you from the other shepherd boys' taunts. When we discovered our heritage, I was the one who planned our return. When we besieged Alba Longa, I was the one who led the charge that broke their walls. The throne is mine by right of blood, birth and deeds." Remus's laugh was bitter as winter wind, filled with disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. "Protected me? Brother, your memory serves your ambition rather than truth. We protected each other, planned together, fought side by side as equals. But I see now that in your mind, I have always been nothing more than your shadow, your junior partner in a destiny you believed belonged to you alone." The confrontation that followed was not the clash of armies but something far more devastating. The collision of two hearts that had beat as one since before their birth. Two souls that had shared everything until the poison of power began to seep between them like acid dissolving gold. They argued through the night, their voices echoing through chambers that had once rung with their united laughter, their words growing more bitter with each exchange. Outside the palace walls, the people of Alba Longa went about their daily lives unaware that their liberation was transforming into something darker. In the markets, merchants spoke excitedly of the new golden age that would surely follow the defeat of the tyrant. In the temples, priests offered prayers of thanksgiving for the divine justice that had restored rightful rule to their land. Children played games where they pretended to be the heroic twins, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the tragedy unfolding in the royal chambers above. But the gods were watching, and their hearts were heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Mars, the divine father of the twins, felt the approaching catastrophe like a dagger twisting in his immortal chest. From his throne in the heavens, he could see the threads of fate weaving themselves into a pattern that would stain his name with sorrow for all eternity. His sons, born of divine fire and mortal love, were about to destroy the very bond that had made them legendary. The she-wolf Lupa, who had saved them as infants and watched over them as they grew, came to the palace in the darkest hour before dawn, her golden eyes filled with an anguish that seemed almost human. She sat beneath the window of the throne room where the brothers continued their bitter argument, her mournful howls carrying across the sleeping city like a prophecy of doom. Even the animals of the forest seemed to sense the approaching tragedy. Birds flew in confused circles, unable to find their way, while deer gathered in meadows to stand in silent vigil, their dark eyes reflecting stars that seemed dimmer than usual. As sunrise approached, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the argument reached its crescendo. Two brothers who had conquered a kingdom together now found themselves incapable of sharing it, their divine heritage corrupted by the very human failing of pride. The crown that should have been a symbol of justice and unity had become instead an instrument of division, its weight threatening to crush not just their brotherhood, but the very hope their victory had inspired. The darkest hour was upon them, and with it came the knowledge that some wounds once opened can never truly heal. The years of prosperity had brought unexpected challenges to the magnificent city that Romulus and Remus had built together. Rome's fame had spread across the known world, drawing ambitious men from every corner of civilization, craftsmen seeking to perfect their arts, warriors hoping to serve in legendary legions, merchants eager to trade in the most prosperous markets ever established. But success had created an imbalance that threatened the very foundation of their society. A city populated overwhelmingly by men who yearned for the companionship of wives and the hope of children to carry forward their dreams. In the Senate House, where wisdom had always guided decision-making, the debates grew increasingly heated as autumn approached. Young men who had built magnificent homes found them echoing with loneliness. Veterans who had helped establish Roman law and order returned each evening to hearths that lacked the warmth only feminine presence could provide. Even the most rational among them began to speak of desperate measures, their voices carrying undertones of barely controlled desperation. Brothers. Romulus addressed the assembled crowd in the forum, his golden eyes reflecting the weight of responsibility that had grown heavier with each passing season. We face a crisis that threatens not just our happiness but our survival as a people. A civilization without families is merely a collection of buildings waiting to crumble. We must find a solution, and we must find it soon. The neighboring Sabine tribes possessed what Rome desperately needed: thriving communities rich in daughters whose beauty, wisdom, and strength were celebrated in songs that traveled from village to village. These women, raised in traditions of honor and courage, represented not just potential wives but the very future of Roman civilization itself. They were known for their fierce independence, their loyalty to family, and their ability to manage households with skill that matched any Roman administrator. Remus, his midnight hair now touched with silver but his wisdom deeper than ever, proposed what seemed like an elegant solution. "Let us invite our Sabine neighbors to a great festival," he suggested, his gentle voice carrying the authority that years of successful governance had earned him. "We will honor Neptune with games and celebrations that will display the best of Roman hospitality. Surely, when they witness our prosperity and the opportunities our city offers, many will choose to remain and become part of our growing community." The festival of Neptune was planned with meticulous care, every detail designed to showcase Rome's achievements while demonstrating genuine respect for their neighbors. Invitations were sent throughout Sabine territory, promising days of feasting, entertainment, and cultural exchange that would strengthen bonds between their peoples. The finest wines were prepared, musicians rehearsed their most beautiful compositions, and athletes trained to demonstrate feats worthy of the gods themselves. But as preparations unfolded, darker whispers began circulating through Roman taverns and training grounds. Some of the younger men, their desperation for companionship clouding their judgment, spoke of more direct methods. They referenced ancient traditions where strong warriors simply took what they needed, of cultures where conquest in love was seen as no different from victory in battle. If gentle persuasion fails, these voices argued in shadowed corners where wine loosened tongues and inflamed passions, then perhaps we must convince them more decisively. Are we not offering them opportunities beyond anything their mountain villages could provide? Sometimes the greatest kindness requires initial force, like a physician's painful cure that ultimately saves life. These whispers reached the ears of both brothers, and they felt a chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Romulus, ever the pragmatist, began to consider contingencies that made his divine soul recoil. Remus, whose gentle nature had always guided them toward peaceful solutions, found himself tormented by visions that seemed like warnings from the gods themselves. The festival dawned with deceptive beauty, the morning sky painted in gold and rose. Sabine families arrived in their finest garments, daughters adorned with flowers that caught sunlight like captured stars, their presence transforming the Roman Forum into a garden of feminine grace. Among them walked Hersilia, whose wisdom was renowned throughout the mountain villages, her dark eyes reading the currents of tension that flowed beneath Roman hospitality like underground rivers. For hours, the celebration proceeded beautifully. Roman craftsmanship impressed Sabine visitors, while their mountain songs and dances delighted Roman audiences. Wine flowed, laughter echoed off marble walls, and for precious moments it seemed that cultural exchange might bloom into genuine affection and voluntary unions. But as afternoon shadows lengthened, the atmosphere began to shift. Roman suitors grew more insistent, their courtship transforming from respectful admiration into demanding pursuit. Sabine women, initially flattered by the attention, began to feel hunted rather than honored. Conversations that should have been gentle exchanges became interrogations about marriage intentions and settlement plans. It was Hersilia who first recognized the true danger. "Father," she whispered urgently to Chief Titus Tatius, "we must leave now." The looks in their eyes have changed from admiration to possession. They no longer see us as people to be wooed, but as prizes to be claimed. But it was already too late. As if responding to some prearranged signal, Roman men throughout the Forum suddenly moved with coordinated precision that revealed the festival's true purpose. What had appeared to be spontaneous romantic interest was exposed as a carefully orchestrated plan. Strong hands seized struggling women, arms encircled waists and lifted desperate forms. Voices that had spoken of love now commanded silence and submission. The intervention that changed everything came not from divine forces or heroic rescue, but from the calculated decision of desperate men who convinced themselves that love could be forced and happiness could be stolen. The screams that pierced the evening air above Rome's 7 hills were unlike anything the ancient stones had ever witnessed. Not the cries of battle where warriors faced each other with honor, but the desperate wails of innocence being torn apart by calculated brutality. Hersilia's voice rose above all others, her words cutting through the chaos like blades of pure truth. "You call yourselves civilized while committing the crimes of barbarians. This is not love. This is theft of the most sacred kind. In the days that followed, the magnificent city that had been built on principles of justice and equality became a prison for over 200 Sabine women whose lives had been shattered in a single afternoon of orchestrated violence. The great houses that Roman men had built with pride now echoed with the sound of weeping, their marble halls transformed into chambers of grief where wives who had never chosen their husbands mourned for families they might never see again. Romulus paced his palace corridors like a man haunted by demons of his own making, his golden eyes dimmed by the weight of what he had allowed to happen. The crown upon his head felt heavier than mountains, each jewel a reminder of the price paid in innocence and trust. Sleep fled from him entirely, replaced by waking nightmares where he heard his mother's voice asking how he had become the very thing they had once fought against. "What have we done, brother?" he whispered to Remus during one of their increasingly rare private moments. "We who prided ourselves on being different, on building something better than the kingdoms of our ancestors. What have we become?" Remus, his gentle face aged years in mere days, stared out at the city they had created with such hope and dreams. "We have become exactly what our uncle Amulius was," he replied, his voice heavy with self-loathing that seemed to poison the very air around them. "Men who take what they want and call it necessity, who destroy innocence and name it progress. The gods must be weeping at what their divine sons have wrought." But it was not the brothers' anguish that would prove most significant in the days to come. It was the extraordinary transformation taking place among the Sabine women themselves. Initially paralyzed by shock and grief, many had spent their first days in captivity in states of near catatonic despair. But as the reality of their situation became clear, something remarkable began to emerge from the depths of their trauma. Not acceptance, but a fierce determination to reclaim whatever agency they could from the ruins of their stolen lives. Hercilia became the unlikely leader of this quiet revolution, her voice carrying through the women's quarters like a call to arms that had nothing to do with weapons or warfare. "Sisters," she said to the gathered women, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that captivity could not extinguish, "we cannot change what has been done to us, but we can choose what we do with the time we have left. We can waste away in grief, or we can become something these Romans never expected, a force they cannot ignore." The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The Sabine women began to organize themselves, sharing resources and comfort, creating networks of support that transcended their individual circumstances. They learned to read their captors, which Romans might be susceptible to reason, which were beyond redemption, and which might actually be suffering from guilt over their participation in the mass abduction. Some women, particularly those who had been claimed by younger Romans who showed genuine remorse for their actions, began the delicate process of attempting to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their lives. Not love, that was perhaps impossible under such circumstances, but understanding, partnership, even a form of respect that acknowledged their shared humanity despite the violence that had brought them together. Others, whose Roman husbands showed no remorse or recognition of the wrong they had committed, became masters of subtle resistance. They prepared meals that met technical requirements while remaining deliberately bland. They maintained households that functioned efficiently while offering no warmth or genuine companionship. They bore children when forced to do so, but raised those children with stories of their mountain homeland and the injustice of their captivity. But the most significant transformation was collective. The gradual realization that they possessed a power their captors had never anticipated. As months passed and Roman men who had expected grateful wives instead found themselves living with women who had every reason to hate them, the emotional atmosphere of the entire city began to shift. Guilt, that most corrosive of emotions began to eat away at Roman pride like acid-dissolving metal. Meanwhile, beyond Rome's walls, the response to the mass abduction was building like a storm gathering strength over distant mountains. Sabine fathers, brothers, and husbands had spent months mobilizing every warrior they could find, calling in debts and alliances that stretched across the entire region. Chief Titus, Hecilia's father, had transformed from a peaceful leader into an avenging angel whose fury burned cold and implacable. The women, sensing through various channels that rescue was coming, began to prepare for the moment when they would face the ultimate test of their newfound strength, the choice between vengeance and something far more difficult, the courage to break cycles of violence that had plagued humanity since time began. The morning that would forever change the course of human history dawned grey and ominous, with storm clouds gathering over the 7 hills like the wrath of gods themselves. The Sabine army, 10,000 strong and burning with righteous fury, crested the final ridge overlooking Rome with weapons that gleamed like lightning and hearts that thundered with the need for justice. At their head rode Chief Titus, his weathered face carved from stone and grief, his eyes holding the cold fire of a father who had spent sleepless months dreaming of reclaiming his stolen daughter. Within Rome's walls, the response was swift and desperate. Roman men who had once celebrated their successful acquisition of wives now faced the brutal reality of defending a city against an enemy whose cause was unquestionably just. Romulus stood atop the highest watchtower, his golden eyes reflecting the approaching storm, knowing that every weapon raised in Rome's defense would be lifted in protection of a crime that violated everything he had once believed about honor and justice. "Brother," he called to Remus, who stood silent beside him watching the approaching army. "How do we fight men who have every right to hate us? How do we defend what we have built when it was founded on the suffering of the innocent?" But before Remus could answer, the battle was joined with a violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Sabine warriors, driven by months of anguish and the desperate love of fathers for their daughters, fought with a fury that transcended normal human limits. Roman defenders, protecting homes they had built with their own hands but knowing their cause was stained with blood, fought with the desperate courage of men who had everything to lose and no moral ground on which to stand. The clash of metal on metal rang through the morning air like the percussion of doom itself. Blood flowed in rivulets down the 7 hills, mixing with rain that had begun to fall as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the tragedy unfolding below. Warriors on both sides fell like wheat before the scythe, their cries of pain and rage creating a symphony of suffering that seemed to pierce the very soul of creation. In the heart of the city, the Sabine women heard the sounds of battle growing closer with each passing hour. They gathered in the great forum where they had first been seized, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of hope, fear, and grim determination. Hecilia stood before them like a general addressing her troops, though her weapons were words and her battlefield was the human heart. "Sisters," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos surrounding them, "the moment we have waited for is upon us. Our fathers and brothers come to rescue us, and the Romans who stole us prepare to fight to keep their stolen prizes. But we have the power to determine how this story ends. We can choose vengeance or something far more difficult, the courage to break a cycle of violence that will otherwise consume all our children." As the battle raged closer to the forum, the women made their decision. Moving together with the coordinated precision of dancers, they walked directly into the space between the warring armies, their white robes stark against the blood-soaked ground, their voices raised in a cry that somehow carried above the clash of weapons and the shouts of dying men. "Stop!" Hecilia's voice rang out like a clarion call that seemed to freeze time itself. "Stop this madness. We are the women you fight over. Hear our voices. We who have suffered most in this conflict demand an end to bloodshed that will only create more orphans and widows." The effect was immediate and profound. Warriors on both sides, seeing the women they loved or claimed to love standing exposed to the violence they had created, gradually lowered their weapons. Sabine fathers looked into the faces of daughters they had feared dead, while Roman husbands confronted wives whose courage shamed their own cowardice. "Father," Hasilia called to Chief Titus, her voice breaking with months of suppressed emotion, "I am your daughter, and I love you more than life itself, but I am also now the mother of a Roman child, and these women beside me have built new lives from the ruins of their old ones. If you kill these men, you make orphans of your grandchildren. If you continue this war, you destroy the very future you seek to protect." The transformation that followed was not instant. Such profound change never is, but it was undeniable. One by one, weapons were laid aside as both armies grappled with the complexity of what the women had forced them to confront. These were not simply victims to be rescued or possessions to be protected, but human beings with agency who had somehow found the strength to choose healing over revenge. What emerged from that blood-soaked morning was not the victory of either side, but the birth of something unprecedented, a society forced to confront its own capacity for both evil and redemption. The Sabine women had transformed their trauma into wisdom, their suffering into strength, and their powerlessness into the ultimate power, the ability to forgive without forgetting, to build bridges over chasms of pain, and to choose the future over the past. The equilibrium they created was fragile and imperfect, built on the acknowledgement of terrible wrongs that could never be fully healed. But it was also profound in its recognition that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting, but in refusing to let hatred determine the shape of tomorrow. In the years that followed the day of choosing, as historians would later call that blood-soaked morning when Sabine women stood between armies and demanded peace, the story of their courage spread like ripples from a stone cast into still water, carrying its message of resilience and redemption to the farthest corners of the known world. The tale was told in 1,000 different tongues, adapted to fit the values and struggles of countless cultures, but at its heart remained the same profound truth, that even in humanity's darkest moments, the light of moral courage could illuminate a path towards something better. The women themselves, rather than being remembered merely as victims who found their voices, became symbols of a different kind of strength entirely. Temples were erected in their honor, not as goddesses to be worshipped from afar, but as examples of human dignity that refused to be extinguished even under the most crushing circumstances. Mothers throughout the Mediterranean world would tell their daughters the story of Hasilia and her sisters, teaching them that true power lay not in avoiding suffering but in transforming it into wisdom. The legal reforms that emerged from their intervention became the foundation of jurisprudence that would influence civilization for the millennia to come. The concept that consent was not just preferable but essential in matters of marriage and family became enshrined in Roman law, spreading to every territory that fell under their influence. Women gained protections and rights that had been unthinkable before the Sabine women proved that victims could become agents of change, that the powerless could wield influence that surpassed any weapon. But perhaps the most profound legacy was not written in law books or carved in marble monuments. It was embedded in the collective consciousness of humanity itself. The story became a mirror in which societies could examine their own treatment of the vulnerable, a standard against which progress could be measured. When communities faced their own crises of conscience, they would ask themselves, what would the Sabine women do? How would they choose courage over revenge, healing over hatred, Generations of Roman children grew up learning that their city's greatness was built not on conquest alone, but on the recognition that true strength came from acknowledging wrongdoing and working to prevent its repetition. The festival that had begun as a celebration and descended into horror became an annual day of remembrance, not celebration but solemn reflection on the capacity for both evil and redemption that existed within every human heart. The diplomatic principles that emerged from the crisis revolutionized how conflicts between peoples were resolved. The idea that those most affected by violence should have the strongest voice in determining how it ended became a cornerstone of international relations. Ambassadors and negotiators would invoke the example of the Sabine women when seeking to end wars that seemed intractable, asking warring parties to consider the perspectives of those who bore the greatest costs of their conflicts. The influence extended far beyond politics and law into the realm of philosophy and ethics. Scholars debated the implications of the women's choice to forgive without forgetting, to build bridges without excusing the chasms that had made them necessary. Their example challenged traditional notions of justice that focused on punishment rather than prevention, revenge rather than restoration. New schools of thought emerged that emphasized the importance of centering victims' voices not just in determining consequences for wrongdoing, but in shaping systems that could prevent future harm. In the arts, the story inspired countless works that explored the complexity of human nature and the possibility of redemption even after the most terrible betrayals of trust. Poets wrote verses that captured the moment when Hersilia stood between armies, her voice somehow carrying above the chaos to demand an end to violence. Painters depicted scenes of women finding strength in solidarity, of enemies laying down weapons in the face of moral courage that shamed their hatred. Musicians composed melodies that seemed to carry the very sound of hearts choosing hope over despair. The story also became a touchstone for movements throughout history where the oppressed sought not just freedom from their oppressors but transformation of the systems that had enabled their oppression. When enslaved peoples sought liberation, when colonized nations fought for independence, when marginalized communities demanded recognition of their humanity, they often invoked the example of women who had refused to let trauma define their futures and had instead used it as fuel for creating something better. Trade routes that had once carried only goods began to carry ideas inspired by the Sabine women's example. Merchants would share stories of communities that had learned to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than violence, of societies that had discovered strength in acknowledging rather than hiding their failures. These stories, like seeds scattered on fertile ground, took root in distant lands and grew into movements for justice and reconciliation that would have been unimaginable before the day of choosing. But the deepest legacy was personal and intimate, embedded in the countless individual moments when people faced with their own choices between revenge and redemption remembered the example of women who had chosen the harder path, and in doing so had changed the world. Their story became proof that ordinary people, even in extraordinary circumstances, could find within themselves the courage to break cycles of violence that had seemed eternal and inevitable. Their legacy whispered across the centuries: transformation is possible, healing can emerge from trauma, and sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest but through the moral courage to choose a better way forward. As we stand here today, more than 2 millennia after Hersilia and her sisters transformed their trauma into a force for justice, their voices echo with haunting relevance through our modern streets, our headlines, our daily struggles with the same fundamental questions about power, consent, and human dignity that they faced on that blood-soaked morning outside Rome's walls. Their story is not ancient history locked away in dusty libraries. It is a living testament to battles still being fought, wounds still bleeding, and courage still desperately needed in a world where women continue to walk in fear. Every day, in cities across our globe, women navigate streets where they must calculate risks that men rarely consider: which routes are safest after dark, which behaviors might be misinterpreted as invitations, which spaces welcome their presence and which merely tolerate it. The fundamental violation that the Sabine women experienced, the reduction of human beings to objects to be claimed, possessed and controlled, manifests in countless forms throughout our contemporary world. From the brazen criminality of human trafficking to the subtle but pervasive assumption that women's bodies and choices exist primarily for others' gratification, the echoes are unmistakable in the testimonies of survivors who find their voices dismissed or questioned, in the persistent myth that victims somehow bear responsibility for the violence inflicted upon them, in the systemic failures that prioritize the reputations of perpetrators over the safety of those they have harmed. Like the Romans who convinced themselves that their desperate needs justified taking what was not freely given, our society still struggles with the temptation to explain away or minimize violations of consent when they serve the interests of those with power. But the Sabine women's legacy offers us something more powerful than despair at the persistence of these patterns. It provides a roadmap for transformation that begins with the recognition that each of us carries within ourselves the capacity to be either part of the problem or part of the solution. Their story reminds us that the most profound changes often begin not with grand gestures or institutional reforms, but with individual moments of moral courage when people choose to see clearly rather than look away. The transformation that their example demands starts with honest self-examination. The willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about our own complicity in systems that diminish women's agency and safety. For men, it means confronting the ways we have been socialized to see women's resistance as challenges to overcome, rather than boundaries to respect. The subtle but powerful messages that teach us to value conquest over consent, possession over partnership. It means recognizing that respect for women cannot be conditional, not dependent on their relationship to us, not limited to those we find attractive or useful, not reserved for those whose choices align with our preferences. The Sabine women's courage challenges us to extend the same consideration we would want for our mothers, sisters, and daughters to every woman we encounter, regardless of how they dress, where they work, what they drink, or how they choose to live their lives. The legacy they left us is not just about dramatic interventions in moments of crisis. It is about the daily work of creating environments where women can exist without constantly calculating their safety, where their voices are heard the first time they speak rather than only after they raise them to levels that make others uncomfortable, where their humanity is acknowledged not as a privilege to be earned, but as an inherent right to be protected. This means challenging the casual misogyny that permeates our conversations and entertainment, refusing to laugh at jokes that treat women's fear or pain as punchlines, speaking up when we witness behavior that makes others uncomfortable, even when it costs us social capital or convenience. It means teaching younger generations that true strength lies not in taking what we want, but in building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine consent. The Sabine women showed us that even those who have been most harmed by existing systems can find within themselves the power to transform those systems rather than simply escape them. Their example calls us to move beyond the limited imagination that sees only two options: acceptance of injustice or cycles of revenge, toward the harder but more meaningful work of creating structures that prevent harm rather than merely punishing it after it occurs. Their voices across the centuries remind us that every time we choose to listen rather than dismiss, to believe rather than doubt, to act rather than remain passive bystanders, we honor their memory and continue their work. Every conversation that challenges harmful attitudes, every policy that prioritizes safety over convenience, Every moment when we choose to see women as full human beings rather than supporting characters in our own stories, these are the daily acts of courage that their legacy demands. The story of the Sabine women is ultimately about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change by refusing to accept that this is just how things are as an excuse for perpetuating harm. Their example burns as brightly today as it did 2,000 years ago, calling each of us to be worthy of the courage they showed and to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. The choice, as always, is ours. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter